Oh, I guess we may as well make a start then. Unfortunately, Richard's not here today, or Greg, so my two main REST hecklers couldn't actually make it. I'm Mark, for anyone who doesn't actually know me. Been doing REST kind of stuff for about the last 3 years at work. A lot of it we've been doing badly, and we haven't actually been doing REST per se, but we've made the move about a year and a half ago, progressing that API further. That's what I should say. So this talk will actually be recorded. So yeah, we're actually also streaming live to the net. There's no one in the chat room yet, but I think Greg and Richard were supposed to be joining us, possibly, and gonna heckle maybe, but we'll see how that goes. So invariably, whenever you talk about REST, all the arguments kind of come back to what did Roy say. So Roy Fielding, who drafted the HTTP spec for I think 1.1, and in his dissertation, which is the great tome of knowledge that's incomplete, is everyone kind of like comes back to what did Roy say, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about hyperlinking happiness and how having a nice RESTful API that actually has links and actually guides you through the API can actually help you build a much nicer API to actually work with. So how many people here have done like Corba and SOAP and had changed something on the back end and then you've broken clients? Or you've changed something on the client and you've broken, no longer works with the server? So that's kind of like the really kind of brittleness that we're going to be talking about moving away from. What we're not discussing is why Rails is not actually REST or HTTP. We're not going to be discussing why JSON sucks or why XML doesn't, because neither of those formats are as bad as YAML, which looks great and was designed to be like human readable, but if you're a machine, you're not actually a human. And it kind of makes the machine work harder to actually kind of parse things and do that kind of stuff. However, we're not going to be talking about Rails, but we do have a word from Roy. So what did Roy say? I mean, has anyone followed or seen what the hoopla about Rails is currently? So I think it started about 10 months ago, there was a bug report filed in GitHub about changing the update semantics of Rails to use the patch command as opposed to put. Because according to HTTP, put is supposed to be an entire representation. So if you put a single value, that's anything that exists. So it's not really usable for partial updates. And that's formal semantics in the HTTP spec from day zero, that it's not partial. But every man and his dog does that. And so this bug report was to try and switch it over. And I think that got merged in last week. And then all these posts started coming up about how REST Nazis and HTTP Nazis are just trying to get in our way, and why can't we just do what we're doing and move on? We don't care about standards or actually being correct. And it's one of the big tenets of REST. If you're doing it properly, you're doing it properly. But even just when you're doing web stuff, if you're doing anything with HTTP, you kind of want to be working with the standards. Because if you're not, then you're doing it wrong. You're not actually doing HTTP. So it is kind of pedantic and kind of works for most cases if you don't honor that. But you can probably get into some problems with like caching servers if they're assuming things are what you put there as an exact copy. They might cache that and just return you that rather than what the server's going to return you. So when you've got multiple layers, not doing things correctly can potentially bite you in the bum. But what we
put can bite you in the bum as opposed to using patch.
So because put is by definition not a partial representation. Say if you've got
Does that mean, but it's going to be cached twice?
It could be. Depending on what your cache settings are, if you put back to a certain URL, just say price was 5, and if the original representation had product information, quantity, all that kind of stuff, you've put back price as 5. So there is price. There is no longer any actual details about quantities or what product it was by formal semantics, because you've put the entire representation, which has only got a price.
And you're saying that patch doesn't.
So patch, by definition, allows for partials. And that was why patch was proposed and actually brought in around about 10 years ago now into the HTTP spec. And I think it was formally ratified by the WebDAV specification group quite later in the piece, but it actually came about 10 years ago, I think. But not many people are actually using it.
So, dumb question. Obviously, gets can be cached. Are we saying that posts, puts, and deletes, HTTP posts, puts, deletes, can be cached?
Puts should be cacheable. Well, puts are supposed to be idempotent. So whatever you put, you can just repeat that time after time after time after time, and you should have the same semantics, the same side effects, or no more side effects. So you can repeat that as many times as you want, and you'd have the same effect.
Unless you're using e-tags or something like that to do...
Yeah, to do optimistic locking and saying, no, as part of this put, you need to give me some kind of information to say what version your assumption was that you're replacing.
Yep.
And if it's not, then we'll just break out. So with posts being allowed to have partials and stuff, they're generally used for like doing an update or creation type operations.
Yeah. So in my little world, I've got posts, puts, and deletes with e-tags, and they're not cacheable, and that's not strictly correct.
Possibly not. Yeah. So what we are just moving back on to. Oh, yeah. Yep.
So what is the difference between the patch and the post?
Good question. Patch, along with it, there have been a few. Well, it's hard to say. I'm not entirely sure, because it kind of crosses over. There was also a specification for a patch format, like there's like the JSON patch format, where it's kind of like a diff for JSON documents, but when looking at the HTTP spec, methods are supposed to be independent of media type or content. So it's just a different command to say this is specifically a patch, or post is for, might have side effects, it might not have side effects, it might be creating new resources, whereas patch is kind of specifically saying it's an update operation. Yeah. So what we are primarily going to be discussing today is how having a standard navigable API provides you flexibility to change the back end, the front end, that kind of stuff, without having downtime or major kind of client-side issues, and how it can be used for doing extensibility in an API and giving you less fragility. So those three kind of things all kind of combine to really being the same thing. When you can change the back end without having to redeploy all of your front ends, then it means you're more extensible, less fragile, and that kind of stuff. So as we mentioned before, SOAP is kind of like it's the static language of web services. So you've got WSDL contracts that generally you'll be generating client-side stub classes with big kind of all the knowledge up front, where you're writing to an API. There's like type information all up the wazoo, specifically for like .NET classes or individual type information, and it's all RPC based. So as a client developer, if you're not really aware of that this library is actually talking to SOAP, you could just be doing all these calls and not aware that there's network latency behind you. And it's kind of like, that can drive you into some really badly performant code and stuff, and it kind of really wants you to know that there's HTTP and there's a web server between you, and that if you're talking to one thing, it might take 2 milliseconds, but if you talk to this other service, it might actually take 3 minutes or 30 seconds or whatever, and having to deal with timeouts or retries or that kind of stuff, where SOAP just kind of really hides all that. And for some things, that kind of sounds nice, but in practice, it feels just really fragile, and you get interoperability issues and stuff. So on the REST side, JAX-RS is like the new kind of standard from Sun and Oracle for doing annotation-based REST services, but again, they kind of drive you to using WADL files, which is the equivalent of a WSDL, which you then, once again, generate client-side stubs and libraries and end up doing RPC-style stuff. There's no kind of discoverability, or it's all hidden from you. I believe the JAX-RS 2.0 spec actually has some more stuff in there for that, for doing link headers and navigation and all that kind of discoverable stuff. But I haven't really followed that, so I'm not entirely sure where that actually sits these days. A number of years ago, through a lot of blog posts and other people on the different REST mailing lists, a guy called Leonard Richardson wrote up a series of things breaking down the different parts of a good REST API and how you can layer that into three different levels, like a maturity level, kind of saying, where actually are you on the REST scale of actually being a good citizen or a bad citizen? So level 0 is kind of XML, RPC, SOAP, where everything's just tunneled through an endpoint where you're just doing message parsing. It's really just RPC. It's kind of like there's no really restiness there. There's no stuff. So, I mean, looking at things like that where RPC is evil, where you kind of have real horrible kind of URLs that the client knows up front, where you've got, effectively, you've just got method calls as URLs, like add student, calculate rank score, find standards, which does all that kind of stuff. It's kind of brittle. Level 1 is like what I think a lot of Rails people are doing, and a lot of people currently deem RESTful and RESty. You've got resources, so you've got individual kind of you've got like a subjects resource, a standard resource, a student resource, but there's no kind of standard structure around how those things are represented. There's no kind of linking, so you're just kind of back in that place of the client having magic URLs hard-coded into things where it's going, well, I've got a student that has an ID of, let's see what we got. We've got a student who has a subject 3243. So I know that I can go to /subject/year/3243 and get that subject resource. So it's kind of baking in that knowledge into the client application, which puts you into being brittle and fragile, because if on the server you want to change where those subjects are or how that URL looks, you can't. How do you evolve your API? Because all the clients are knowing up front and doing all this magic string kind of concatenation, they're just going to break. So I'm going to skip level 2, which talks about actually just using the HTTP verbs correctly for what they are. And I'm jumping straight into level 3, which is being pure. The whole idealized REST, HATEOAS, fully navigable and all that kind of funky stuff. Basically, HATEOAS is, the term means hypertext as the engine of application state. So it means that every resource should contain enough information to tell you about what you can do with it, where you can go from it, what its state is, and how to actually handle it. One of the key tenets there is having a uniform processing model. What that really kind of means is how many people are actually doing kind of REST type HTTP API stuff.
The level below this.
We're hipsters.
Well, I know you're a hipster, Walter. So, do you return application/JSON as a media type? Yeah. How does your client know how to process that?
It's already written in JavaScript.
Is that
It's already written in JavaScript too.
magic?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like JSON, application/JSON, and application/XML, all that tells your client is, I've got an XML file, or I've got some JSON data. It doesn't tell you anything about how to actually understand what's in it. So you can parse it and get an AST or an object structure or whatever, but you're just left there going, huh? What? Yeah, yeah. So, what do we got? Had an interesting flame war on Twitter that then jumped over to IRC yesterday. I kind of brought out the horrible REST term of serendipitous reuse, which is kind of, I don't think it's kind of like the word that all the REST Puritans can like bring out and say, oh no, we need this. So it's like being able to pick any REST service anywhere and be able to work with it without any foreknowledge of how it works. Having a standard media type that you can walk through and it's got links, it tells you where to go, you can understand things. Like any Atom feed that you get, it's got a strict standard structure. You know it's got a title, it's got links, it's got items inside it, which have other links which go forward. So an API that knows how to read and work with RSS feeds or Atom feeds can work with any Atom feed. The Atom feed might have additional information that it doesn't yet know about, but it can at least walk through and display anything that's in there as a feed, and you can walk through it, that kind of stuff.
But I mean, it depends on what the client is, doesn't it?
It does depend on what the client is.
Like, I mean, you can use SOAP UI and hit a SOAP service, but that doesn't finish your application.
No.
You can do the same with Wisdom. You can explore the services, and you can point it at the Wisdom endpoint on iOS, and they'll come back and go, hey, here's all the stuff I can do.
Yes, but you can't dynamically have your client walk that and discover necessarily. Because every WSDL is going to be different. There's no kind of standard structure. There's
Every Wisdom supports the same Wisdom basic functions, the same with every Atom feed supports the Atom protocol.
Well, kind of, yeah. It at least says, I've got these methods, whereas an Atom kind of... Was that someone in the chat room talking to us?
Take it off.
Oh, it's a Richard.
Oh, yeah, we're watching. Sorry.
Did you have something to say, or are you just coughing?
No, I didn't have anything to say.
That's a first.
I just think it's a jump from being able to go, yeah, there's a link
Sorry
there,
about that.
I can hit the link, versus, oh, I'm actually building that that's actually going to do something sensible with the data and present it to the user and do something with sensible with the link.
Yeah, so that's where having a link relationship type and your actual contract of how your API works comes into play. So a lot of people talk about, I remember an argument that we had on the podcast a couple of years ago where Greg was saying, like, but you've got, with REST, you've got no contract. If things can change underneath you and you're doing it all at runtime, you have no contract. Whereas with SOAP, you've got the entire contract all up front, right? That tells you every method in the entire system that you could possibly ever think of doing. It doesn't tell you that these particular methods are available only at a certain time or based on a certain state of a resource. So with a link, with links inside the actual resource, when you're looking at that representation of something, that can have links, and a link has a relationship type, which tells you why that link exists and how that relates to the resource you're looking at. So in your API documentation, you might say that a link of type students tells you where you can find students. So you could have an API that just randomly walks any link and just displays the data back to the client, which is kind of like what a web browser does. But if you're wanting to have more richer semantic aware clients where they're saying, well, I know that I'm looking for students, but I don't know where they are. But I've found a link that tells me this is a student link. I'll then follow where that currently points to. And that kind of leads you through the API. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I just think that it's still almost at the level of, yeah, if you want to change your link in the back end, yeah, you could. But otherwise, it's almost at the level of documentation. It's not actually building a complete front end that actually needs to present something to a user to do something.
Yeah, so that's where things like code on demand can actually come into play, where based on that link, you could actually also download code that is associated with that link for the client to actually run. That's effectively what web browsers do. You hit a URL, you download JavaScript, you download CSS, you download images. That renders the page. You follow another link, that gives you the HTML that then says, oh, but here's this other CSS and other JavaScript that you need in order to interpret and actually execute that page. So that's kind of giving you a dynamic UI that's kind of fully flexible kind of stuff. That really only works if you trust both your client and your server, though. Because having arbitrary code execute in your application could be kind of scary.
So what he's saying here is that, sorry,
Continue.
I'm supposed to be on mute.
Standing ovation there.
What you're doing is you're offloading.
I'm just trying to explain to the people who are here and watching you on the big screen projector what it is that you're saying.
Right. Here or there?
Maybe they're not here. We have 3 people here watching what you're saying.
Surely what you're doing is you're offloading the responsibility of writing the logic for what you support and what you can discover in your client to manage state into your protocol, and then writing different logic for state discovery into your client. So where's the win? I mean, if you're writing logic for discovery, you already have to write that when you're writing your client's ability to read and handle students. Never mind the fact that it can discover students by wandering a document which has been returned to it. It still doesn't know what
True.
students as an actual implementation, unless you do that. You know,
So one of the things that we're doing in our system at work, and which I can almost show to a degree in the demonstration that I actually have for later, is if your client is aware that it has actions that it can apply to a resource. Like when say you're looking at a student resource, there are common things that you might be able to do to a student. You can kick them out, you can fail them, you can pass them, or you could do other things with them. That was not what I was thinking. And as the client, you could, if they were all represented as links on the resource, would say a common relationship type of, I'm in action, you can do something with me, then your UI can render, say, toolbar buttons or menu items based on the current state of the resource. So if you're looking at the column student, you could the server might come back and say, well, he's currently enrolled, so you can fail him, you can kick him out, or if we look at the Walter resource and he's not enrolled, then there might just be a single link that says you can enroll him. And then the UI can dynamically change what it's displaying.
So you write your client implementing generic concepts as opposed to
fixed logic, yeah.
I mean, I think that case there, like that's not more tangible. So there is also the operations that you may or may not be able to do based on the state and based on who you are.
Yes.
So truly serendipitous stuff is not that like how am I I've discovered a new link, right? Awesome. What happens now? That becomes a little less hard to envision and use the
Yeah, so that's where it starts to get a little bit hairy and stranger, and we haven't really kind of worked that out fully yet. But any relationship type that is not in the IANA registry as like an official blessed standard link is supposed to be a URI. So it's actually an identifier. Mostly you could actually use a URL for that relationship type. And then if you resolve and read that URL from that relationship type, then you could pull back some additional JavaScript or code, be it an Android intent or a bit of a DLL or something to tell you, well, here's a link over here. This is how you actually use it. And then dynamically build up a UI, that kind of stuff. That would give you the whole serendipitous reuse kind of stuff, but it does mean that you trust executing arbitrary code from a server. And I think in a lot of places in like websites, we've grown to trust that, and that often bites people in the bum when they download screensavers for Windows. Yeah, so one of the things that I've kind of been thinking over the years is that a good REST API is kind of like NetHack. Kind of what we were saying just before about discoverability, and you can see things that you can do on a resource at a particular point in time. Things with like MUDs and old school text adventures, you have things like, you're in a room, there is an exit to the north, to the south, you see a grue. Do not be eaten by that grue. That's an old NetHack thing. But as you're in that room, you only see things that are related to that room. You've got no state and knowledge about what's in the room that you went just before, because if you go back to that room, there might now be someone else in that room. But so you can only see what you're currently looking at. And as you're walking around, it's guiding you through the maze of the API. Sound good?
Yeah, but you're still developing a large amount of extra flexibility and functionality into your client-side application and server-side applications to be able to publish all of this. Are you really winning? I mean, yes, you get the slight bit of flexibility of not having to republish a wisdom file. But that's not really that expensive.
For smaller applications, possibly not. But if your application is going to be something that's going to grow over time and maybe have plugins from third-party developers or be modular and have different teams working on different things that have different release cycles and different cadences, then...
Undeclared clients. Undeclared clients. So people
Yeah.
consume your feed and complain the breaks, but don't
Could
tell
I
you
make a
that they
suggestion that you get on with the presentation and take questions at the end?
Sounds like a plan. So about a year ago, Mike Kelly, one of the people on the REST Discuss mailing list, that red does not show up well there, came up with a format called HAL, which is the Hypertext Application Language. It's an XML and JSON format that represents a formal semantic for a REST resource that has resources, links, properties, and embedded resources. So the way that it works is every resource, you know that it's got a certain structure and that it has links that follow a certain way of working with things. So after last week's, or 2 weeks ago now, JUG presentation on CSS, Richard challenged me to create a REST API for a random application that he was going to give me. So that Friday he came over and gave me a bunch of Grails code and a database in Oracle format that I had to convert all the SQL to Postgres and stuff. But basically it was an application to calculate the score, the ranking score of a student inside based on NCA results. Why did I make that so slow? So basically, I didn't actually see any of these screenshots until I think Sunday after I'd written the presentation and all the code. So I didn't actually know how the application worked, and it was quite interesting that how I laid out my resources in the flow actually mimicked it quite similarly. And I think that actually works quite well. It is pretty much the same as a website where you're walking through different steps.
Correct me if I'm wrong, that is a website.
That is a website, yes. Yes. So it's very simple form-based where you're going through steps of finding subjects, finding standards, adding results and all that kind of stuff. So, and then we've got results. Let's go through that one. So this was kind of the diagram of my REST API that I kind of came up with, where we have, at the top we've got our single entry point. For a nice, truly RESTful service, and air quotes being pedantic, you should only ever have one documented entry point. There is only one place to actually enter a service, and everything else should be self-describing and tell you how to reach everywhere else. So from that entry point, I can add a student, or I can go to a student that already exists. I can search for subjects, and then from subjects I can add a result or walk through kind of things. So we'll just actually jump over to the actual demonstration. So for the last 6 months or so in my tinkering and experimenting with HAL and stuff, I ended up writing a library to actually be a parser, a generator, and actually allow me to write all the kind of stuff that actually works with that format. So I've got a simple Java REST server just running here, and my little client. So if I open my localhost web server, can we all see that at all? So that's given me a resource, which is the root of the service, that tells me I've got 2 links that I can go next. I can go to my search subject link or my add student link. I did actually write some documentation on the API to like just working through sort of stuff. So the notion here is that the client knows nothing about the server. However, I do. I know how the link relations work, which allows me this is just a demonstration service, but as you'd write that client, you don't necessarily need to know everything. So this little command line client that I've written just uses JLine for adding autocompletion, and all the autocompletion actually comes out of the responses from the server. So I can follow, and then that's autocompleted and discovered the links and show me what link relationships I can currently do on that particular resource. So that's kind of like what I was saying, when you're looking at a student, you can add buttons. You can add different actions based on what the server comes back with. So I can search for a subject. That doesn't actually give me anything, because I know that my API isn't complete. So I want to add a search clause. So in the way that this client works, that just adds all them as query parameters. Unfortunately, the guy who was here last time who wanted to know about paging, I don't think is actually here. So if I search for all the subjects starting with A, we can see we've got our response here where we've got a link to next, which takes us to the next page of results. So I'm currently only returning 4 results per page. And we've got another link to search, so we can just go back to do another search. And we've got embedded resources that just display minimal information about a particular... No. Minimal information about the specific subject. So if I follow, I can follow the next link, and that returns me the next page, of which now we only have a link to the previous page. We no longer have a link to next. So the UI can then respond and actually give you like buttons that turn on or turn off, turn on, turn off. And we can play that dance as much as we want. If we go back to our root, we can do other things where we follow add student, namespace it properly. And one of the things that I've, like, over the years come to think of is because the whole patch put, you can't do partial updates or partial creation kind of stuff and updates. In my mind, every resource should be immutable. No resource can be changed directly. Everything has to be changed through something a bit smaller. So for changing the price of a product, you would end up, say, going to product/price, which would just give you that sub view of that product, and then you could do your complete representation of the price of that product. So that's
complex methods you end up writing procedure calls.
Well, they're not necessarily procedure calls. It's kind of more
Macros.
What happens if I would like to update two attributes of the object?
That's what I mean.
well. So you would have to, how you design your API, you would have to choose what granularity you want to change. Say, like on a customer, you might have billing information, you might have address information. They could be two sub-resources that if you want to change billing information, you need to put back all of the billing information. As opposed to, you could actually write it, depending on how you write your API, you could actually have it go down to individual fields and actually have the server magically via reflection do all that kind of stuff. So you're still representing a single field as a resource that you could modify independently, but you're not changing the full resource. That all depends on how you actually write your client and your server. So here we've followed our add student link, which the get of that, I'm just returning the minimal representation that you need. So you can get that resource and it tells you that we need a display name and a year. So I can post back and that's posted to that URL, created the new resource and sent me a redirect back to the actual resource that was created. And then once I've read that, then we've got our new resource that has the full representation.
What's the add a resource? Like if you look at purely sort of URL perspective, you add bit. Wouldn't that be a resource? Sort of define an operation as a resource?
Probably using add is probably the wrong term there. I was thinking that this morning, that it should probably be something like empty student or template student. So
Post to students. Post onto that. Would you post a student? Because you're creating a student.
you could do. The reason why I did it that way is that you're actually requesting a template. You're requesting, so if you follow the get of that URL, it's returning you what you need to post back.
I've seen head being used for that. So if you go head on student, you get back the template.
You could do head, you could do options, or any of those kind of things. With head, you're only supposed to be returning headers, not any kind of body. So you wouldn't really be able to put in an object structure or something back there.
Why do you need actually to specify the post if you are explicitly calling at operation?
What's that?
I mean, you have an at operation as a resource, right? So, but then you don't need actually to specify a post, right? You can just get it, and because it's calling the at, it doesn't actually matter what type of the request we are actually using, right?
Well, you wouldn't use put to add student because that would be replacing what's at.
No, but I'm saying that I have a problem with the at operation in the resource, right? Because if you would like to update a student, it should be just a student and post to it.
So,
not like slash.
If you had an add template and you had post is like magic, whatever, the post is sort of like merging information into the template, and as a consequence of that, you get redirected to a new resource. That sort of makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah. So this is still kind of the area where I'm still feeling out how that actually should work. And
if you did a get against slash students, you'd get the template back. If you did a get against slash students and then you had your search params on the end, That's it.
Well, if you do a get against slash,
level 2 or level 1 of hipster world. So generating our URLs kind of that magical thing as opposed to these.
yeah. Although if you're getting slash students, would you not expect to get a list of students?
Yes, but I wouldn't use a template. So I'm just trying to understand. How
Yeah.
it would be done in the
So that's where things can get a bit messy, because you could say, if you could go to slash students or slash students slash, they're two completely different resources.
It does kind of feel like a thing that should be dealt with.
Yeah. The other side of that is the URL does not matter one bit, because as far as the client's concerned, it's just following a link relationship. So it's whether that URL actually ends up is kind of irrelevant to the client.
So it could be like slash underscore template.
Yeah. So if we then go,
The template's only there for documentation. An application wouldn't expect to go and get the template
well,
as
the client could actually take that template and use that to dynamically generate a form URL, form dialog. Yeah. It's the same as kind of like HTTP. In normal web, you have an HTML form that gives you a template of what you should be posting back.
It would be required to visit this template to create a new custom. You couldn't do it from student detail records or something like that. You have to walk all the way back and then come or entry point and in here. You have to visit this point in the structure to know that these verbs or resources are available to you at the time.
unless you read out once and then you know.
Oh,
Well,
then you're
no,
remembering state.
because
State is
yes. So
No, well,
The thing that we're not-
The rest says that you go to slash student, you do a post, and you post student data.
Not as HATEOAS.
not with HATEOAS. So what we're not talking about here at all is any kind of authorization or permissions. So just because I'm making the request now and I see that link doesn't mean tomorrow when I've had my access revoked that I can follow that link.
Or
So-
that the link will remain the same.
Or that the link is actually, yeah, the link may have actually changed location.
Does it reference the link and say that you can post to slash add?
In the resource it doesn't. In my API documentation for the...
Documentation that you read, it's not actually in the link up here, is it?
No, so that's where you can actually have on the... So what we have here is we've got a link for add result. That's the relationship type. And so as I was saying before, all relationship types that aren't IANA registered should be URIs. So in HAL, we're actually, the XML representation, we actually reuse XML namespacing. So the RSC tells us that we can resolve that URL of add result by looking at localhost 4567/rels/add student. That could be human readable documentation on how we should be expecting, what we should expect at the end of that URL and what we can post back or put back.
What's add/rel/add student add result?
So that's just the relationship type saying if you're wanting to add a student, this is where you go to do add students. It's kind of dereferencing.
We go to students/add.
That's the actual current URL. That URL might change if we upgrade our server. So as far as the client's concerned, it would be following a rel, a link of add student. And-
When you do the post display name mark there, what URL are you actually posting to?
The way that I've written this current client, that's just posting back to the last resource.
But I mean, what is that? Because I can't read it off the page.
And Tmax isn't actually allowing me to scroll. Yes, we'd followed add student, and that gave us that template, of which then I posted back to that template. Yeah. So if we actually go back to our root resource, we can now see that we've now also got a link to that student that we just created.
Sorry, your API design suddenly doesn't scale.
Why?
Paging? Very slow. Just a comment on you should have a list students and verb as opposed to a here's a student or resource.
On the root, yes. That's just there for demonstration purposes. Yeah. And if we wanted to follow student,
Could you have been clever there and said, well, I only let you search for students if there's any students in the system?
yeah.
So off the root, you could have said, there's no students, you can't do search, but if there are...
And then surely the root document could have actually returned that the only thing you can possibly do is... And that would be...
That's not what I wanted. So what I probably would have done is actually use URI templates, which initially was part of the link header specification, but was then pulled out because it was a lot more complicated. But I can actually say, we have a link to student, and instead of having the ID there, you would template that to say ID. So as long as you knew a student ID, the client can then follow that link and just replace the template. So that actually solves your scalability issue there. That not everything needs to be paged or have individual...
There needs to be knowledge in the client on how to deal with the application server. So you're not gaining anything by changing your protocol.
Well,
Having to implement extra flexibility into your client would not reward. You're not getting anything for free.
well, you do gain that if your client knows... So if you've written your client that it's following a student link and it knows that it's templated, it can just follow that link no matter how you change it. So you do get that flexibility of being able to change the back end without affecting the front end.
True, you lose magic URIs.
You use, yeah, effectively you're gaining dereferencing and that kind of stuff. One of the problems I do see when people look at this and HAL and all that kind of stuff is they go, what, you mean I have to start from scratch and change both my back end and my front end and actually write my API, my application specifically for this style of application? I can't just like flick a magic switch and everything's golden. It's like, yeah, you need to buy into that whole process of doing it this way. And I think once you get over that and actually you start designing a system that is extensible in a way like this, then you do start to actually gain benefit.
The sales pitch has to be benefit, not the once you get over it.
This is, I think, why a lot of people go, let's not do REST.
Then let's do a better sales pitch.
What are your clients? Are they all browsers or are they something else?
Currently, it's just our only client is a browser, but we do have some people now doing like shell kind of stuff or integration from third-party applications.
So you're...
We're not currently using this in production, though. In production network, we've currently got link headers, and that's as far as we've got so far.
Link headers.
So similar to here, where we've got links actually inside a resource,
Yep.
The link header specification allows you to is a link header,
Headers.
HTTP header, where you can have a link
Yep.
with a relationship type and a URL.
And then what, your JavaScript reads the headers?
Yeah. So as the JavaScript reads the resource, it looks at the headers as well to find out what meta information about that resource is available.
Can you give an example of what you did with that information? Button, or do you...
Yeah, show a button. If we select 3 or 4 invoices, then the request is back from the server, and the server will come back and say, well, these are the operations that you can currently do on that set of invoices. As you select and deselect things, it will say, oh, this operation is no longer available. These ones are available. These ones are not available. So based on what you select, the UI can actually be flexible and adapt.
All right. So as opposed to looking at a status value in the actual resource data.
Yeah. So it does kind of give you that flexibility. And one of the nice things I find with link headers is that it's independent of the actual content payload. So those link headers exist whether you're looking at CSV, whether you're looking at PDFs, looking at JPEGs, whether you're looking at JSON data. It's in the same place, it's independent.
Can you specify? Can you say if you want to add a student, you should do a post to this?
As far as the link specification is concerned, method is not part of a link, because you would then possibly do an options request on that resource. There's nothing to actually stop you from actually adding those things in there as additional attributes, just to give your client a bit more knowledge that, oh, I'm supposed to do a delete here or a post, or that's where it's still kind of questionable. Like in the HAL kind of stuff, it's the way Mike designed it is that all the knowledge is in the link relationship, and then you'll look at your documentation for that relationship type.
So the relation could be pointing back to the collection you want to write, the collection of students. And you kind of go there and you say, what can I do with a student? So well, you can delete one, you can post.
Yeah, so that's effectively what that subjects link is. That's the collection of subjects that you search and filter by, and you would somehow document that, and be that just in a Word document or something. Yeah.
Could you please show me how can I get a list of students?
No, because that doesn't exist in the API. However, so...
I mean, what will be the URL for getting the students?
Well, ooh. So that's actually giving us our list of students there.
And if you would like to implement the student list, what will be the URL for the student list?
Well, then I would assume I would create a search student link that points to a student's resource.
So I need to do a search for a student with some parameter to get the list of all students.
That depends on. It all depends on how you want to write your API.
Well, I would like to write it as get on the students /
Yeah.
The same way the subjects work.
It would be the same way that subjects works. That's not currently implemented in the API, so you need to change your server how to do that. And then when you read that, you would just add a new link to search students or whatever you want to call it. Any client that doesn't know about that link doesn't care. They don't change. They just use existing behavior. Any new clients that know that, oh, I know that I'm looking for a students or an add students or a search students link, I can find that. So that means you can evolve and add new things to the API without actually affecting client applications.
When you did search subject, you put a parameter which is already more than one parameter. Is there a way in HAL to specify what parameters are required?
HAL is only the representation. It's nothing to do with the server. So it only deals with actually representing a resource. It doesn't actually care about what URLs you're using, what mount points you're using, whether you're using Spark or ASP.NET MVC or whatever.
I just mean, like, in order to search a subject, regardless of any implementation, you're going to need to send a parameter which is syntax. So is there a way in HAL to do that? Or is that something you need to know?
Well, that's where URI templates would come in play. Because what I should have actually done here is actually had question mark search equals paren term or something, and so that just gives you that template to say if you're searching for this term, then this is the URL that you use and replace the term here.
Okay, yeah, that's...
And so that's kind of actually separate from how you represent it. That's in its own little specification of how you use URI templates. And it's quite a complicated specification, because it deals with all the things about how you handle if you've got repeating elements, or whether you go like item equals 5, item equals 2, or item equals 5, comma 2, it's a specification that's kind of grown a little bit out of, kind of grown larger than it probably should be.
So the documentation that will follow this will describe all the resources?
Yeah. So
you know in advance what resources you're working with, and you can say build a website to deal with those. But this approach will just tell you how to link and what the relationships are. Because you wouldn't have dynamically adding new resources and just popping them. Or would you?
You could do dynamically just adding new resources if the client. So if you are, that's where kind of bringing saying, we're now doing API version number 2, and we're actually adding in a expired students or a cancelled students resource and a way of finding students who have left. Well, you can bring that new resource in and document that, and you could tell your clients and say, hey, we're introducing this new API. If the old stuff isn't going away or changing, but if you want to find the existing students or past students, then this link will be coming in shortly. You could also then tell them saying, these links will be going away in 6 months' time. They're still going to be there for now. This is the new way of doing it, that means that they can write their client to say, oh, if this link exists, I'll do this operation, do it this way. But if it's not there and we've got this other link, we can pre-set that up, and you could leave that old API there for, say, 6 months or so, and then new clients would use the new API, old clients would use the old API. When you return those resources, you could do response codes and say, hey, warning, this is an expired API, here's the results, but be aware it's going away soon. You might want to update your server.
Do people put version numbers in the URLs? As a general.
Some people do. So,
I mean, as far as I've ever read it, it's just whatever if it feels right, kind of thing. So I mean, we put it in the domain, we put it in the URL.
So,
what I mean is like version 1/student/ blah blah blah. So if you've got a very public API and you think you're going to version it, you're going to basically change the API.
You could have API 1.
yeah. So you can do that, but that's just really kind of, that's going back to level 1 of that maturity model, where your clients are knowing up front that I'm going to version 1 or version 2 or version 3. Whereas here you could actually have links, and you could you could actually, one approach that I was thinking about the other day is with the relationship types. So a relationship type can actually be is actually made up of space delimited relationship types, so you can have multiple values in there. So we could actually say this is the add student and version 1. You might have another link which is add student version 2. And then as a client, if you start off that way and all your clients are aware of this, if they're writing for version 1, they could follow links that only point to version 1 of the API. Or if they don't care, they'll just follow whichever one they want.
Have you deviated from the principle of REST client when you come across the problem of having to version your API?
I think so. In most cases, what I've been seeing just in the stuff that we've been doing at work and over time is that it's not necessarily the API that we're versioning as in URLs or where things are, it's the representation that we're versioning as well. Like
that's what you usually do when you version your API. You either depreciate a bunch of methods which nobody's going to call anymore, in which case they disappear and nobody's following them and nobody has access to them. The client doesn't magically think it can jump to a URL which isn't on the resource which has been returned.
Yeah.
Therefore it's never available, and therefore you don't have to worry about the version follow.
What's going on?
Yeah. So one of the arguments I have seen against that is having different URLs is that no matter what version, no matter how old Colin is always Colin. He's not version 1 of Colin, version 2 of Colin. you always look at Colin and see what he currently looks like. If you want to, this is kind of where having media type explosion comes into play, and where people were doing saying, well, if I request the application/JSON/version 1 representation of Colin, I'll see the older one, but if I request the newer version, I see the newer version. But if I just say, give me any version, I might just always get that latest version. It's the representation that changes, not where you find him.
If you see a situation where you have a web page and you have two resources, and then you actually go, what I actually do with the operations that are available are really this combination of these resources. Are you saying you're always going to put the operations in a resource, so you would create like an aggregate resource?
Say again?
So say you've got a student and a subject on the same page, and in the context of that page, there are operations that only make sense in the context of that page, that are not necessarily the combination of the operations that are available in the resources. Do you then say, I have a need for this new kind of resource with this new set of operations?
A verb like calculate, score.
If you find yourself performing operations like coming up with new operations that aren't defined by your service API, that's a smell, right?
Yes and no. I mean, the client can do whatever it wants with its own client state. There are a lot of times where you might have smaller functionality that you add to the client, which might appear as though you're modifying small individual pieces of a resource, but then put back the complete representation to the server. With a lot of more things that people are doing with Ajax and a lot of client-side logic kind of stuff, you could actually build more kind of all those smaller operations and stuff. Once you've got a lot of resource information from the server, you could probably actually build in a lot of those operations for like client-side search and client-side filtering. That doesn't need server-side filtering necessarily. Sometimes it might be easier to have that operation on the server, or it might be easier or better for latency reasons on the client. I think that's kind of it depends on the context of what you're actually wanting to doing, and I guess it is kind of a code smell kind of thing, but more in that it might be easier to do the change on the client side and roll out a new version of the website rather than going through a process of rolling out an entire backend that might need database changes or new resources that make the code cleaner and easier to work with. But it might just be easier to actually hack it in. That puts you all into technical debt, and kind of eventually that might bite you in the bottom and that kind of stuff.
Is that what you meant, or were you referring to resources that aren't URLs that don't really refer to resources, like calculations or?
Well, I mean, what I kind of the root of this was really, should I rely entirely on the server-side resources to tell me which operations I can and cannot perform? Should I perform some client-side calculation, which is like, I have this and this, and so I'll work out that.
Well, I actually think that's actually a really good idea of possibly doing that. I mean, like, just because I think what I was actually thinking, that's where mashups come into play. Just because a server is giving you this information and another server is giving you that information, those two servers don't need to know about each other. The client can go, well, I've got this information, that information, I'll do my calculation and give you something else. So you can actually, I think that's perfectly fine. Yeah. Because otherwise you're very limited, and that puts you straight back into being very fragile, very... Yeah, it kind of puts you almost back into RPC mode, where you're saying, in order to change the client, I need to change the back end. And it kind of puts you really back to square one.
Back to square one, you're saying SOAP, right?
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, to me, I think SOAP, server-to-server type communication generally that's actually not. That's exactly what you want. We're pretty close to what you want. You want a defined API, and you want a version.
But this is still a well-defined API, because you'd have your API documentation and having...
It's not as well described as wisdom of the schema that you generate.
True, but WSDLs don't really give you... They give you an API that you can code to, but you're still inflexible. But you can still have that contract that's written in stone that developers can refer to and say, when I follow this, this is the contract that I'm writing to. This is the contract that we've all agreed to. It's more instead of having one big giant contract, you're having lots of smaller contracts. But the contract for those specific things is kind of set.
Implies that you've got some definitive schema that you've got.
For the resources, yes. Yeah, so that's where by following a specific link type, that will be the documentation there would tell you that
I can't get this contract until runtime, right?
No. So what I was saying there is that these links could actually resolve to websites where you could get human-readable documentation or machine-readable documentation.
Or like a wisdom.
Yeah, but it's discoverable at runtime. But I could also give you a PDF. Yeah, so you could do all those things and just show errors to the end user.
Or no, deal with them as state errors in the client.
Or yeah, or you could be told up front that these operations, there's no point even trying this operation because I'm telling you, you do not have permission. The student is no longer a student. He can't be enrolled in subjects. So I'll tell you up front, don't even bother adding a link to say enroll. Because I've seen that too often in a lot of sites and stuff where you go, oh, I'll go enroll, fill out an entire form, and then it says, sorry, the student doesn't exist, or student's gone, can't be enrolled. It's like, well, why did you lead me through a 10-step wizard? So if you could push all that state up front to say these are things that you can do or can't do.
Does your example have any things you do with students?
The only thing that I do with students that I didn't actually get that code actually working. So the whole point of the website initially was to add students, add results, and get a rank score. And so calculate rank score was like a method that you would call to calculate stuff. And what I actually ended up doing...
Is that always a good thing?
I ended up actually just putting that as an attribute on the student. When you see the current state of a student, you get the rank score. If we add subjects and results, when we look at the student, we see a new rank score. You don't actually need to call calculate as such.
So you can lazy calculate that.
Yeah.
But students don't need a second.
So you could calculate that at the time that you do the get, or you could do that as a side effect of actually posting the subject. That could be going fire off a MapReduce job or...
You shouldn't be doing that at get. You're doing a calculation at get.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that.
That implies that it's changing the state of something.
You can do the calculation and say.
Sorry?
You can do the calculation and say.
Yeah.
The representation that comes out of the server doesn't have to be the same as the representation of the disk.
No, but it's happening at that time, so it might be a different calculation. It's happening at a different time.
Yeah.
So to me, that's
if you return my age, if you return the age of the student, you've got the same thing.
Quick calculations, long calculations. It brings us to the question that you put up for, earlier, is that applications using SOAP, which hide the fact that you're over a delayed connection, which should be written in an asynchronous manner, using REST and HATEOAS in fact, this client that we're currently looking at that you've written here does the same thing. It's still hiding what should be an asynchronous implementation behind asynchronous lock. So
well, I'm doing a get request, so I'm
giving us that win.
I'm doing it well.
It's just making it.
Well, I'm not doing a method call. I'm actually doing an HTTP call.
Yeah, but so you're doing an HTTP call which potentially does a calculation which could be long running, which potentially makes it take a minute and a half. Let's put forward the hypothetical
So
situation.
it was about now that the conversation continued into an endless argument over semantics and API design. And, well, frankly, that's boring. So, thank you for watching. I'm Mark Derrickett, and good night. Goodbye.